Hello, my name is Ian St John, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the 10th in our series of St John's Pipecasts, and the 6th, would you believe, to have been issued during the COVID pandemic, which does put things in rather sobering perspective. Our subject today is the model of economic development formulated by the economic historian Alexander Gerschenkron. Now, Gerschenkron was born in Russia in 1904, but left Russia during the revolution with his family, travelling first to Austria, where he completed his education, and then moving on to the United States. And he spent the last 30 years of his life as an academic at the University of Harvard. He developed his model of industrial growth during the 1950s, and its main elements were contained in his 1962 book, Economic Backwardness in Historical Perspective. Now, this is a curiously rare and expensive volume. Fortunately, I came upon a rather battered paperback copy many years ago, and although rather the worse for wear, it's proven sufficient, hopefully, for the purposes of this talk. So what is the purpose of Gerschenkron's model of industrialization? Gerschenkron's model seeks to account for the leading feature of industrialization in 19th century Europe. Rather than saying that each national industrialization in, for example, Germany, France or Russia, has its own unique and contingent character, he argues that yes, each industrialization assumes a distinctive form, but that this form or pattern is explained by reference to a single explanatory factor. What is this factor? It is, says Gerschenkron, the degree to which a particular country exists in a state of backwardness at the time of its commencement of modern economic growth. In other words, the character of each nation's industrial trajectory will vary systematically according to the degree of economic backwardness characterizing the country at the point at which its takeoff into modern industrial growth commences. That is to say, the observed features of industrialization are a function of a country's degree of economic backwardness. As Gerschenkron stated in the introduction to his book, these essays, he writes, are dominated by the general hypothesis that very significant interspatial variations in the process of industrialization are functionally related to the degree of economic backwardness that prevailed in the countries concerned on the eve of their great spurts of industrial growth. In this fashion, the industrial history of Europe is conceived as a unified and yet graduated pattern. There are two key terms here that we need to understand. First, industrialization. What Gerschenkron means here, and what he is actually interested in, is the rapid acceleration of an economy's rate of industrial growth as it passes through what we might call its industrial revolution. To quote Gerschenkron again, in a number of major countries of Europe, industrial development did not proceed at an even pace. On the contrary, after a lengthy period of fairly low rates of growth, came a moment of more or less sudden increase in rates, which then remained at an accelerated level for a considerable period. That was the period of the great spurt in the respective countries' industrial development. Now, although Gerschenkron disliked, obviously enough, comparisons to Rostow's stages of economic growth model, he's really talking about something very similar to Rostow's takeoff in sustained modern economic growth. The difference is that while Rostow was talking about the economy as a whole, Gerschenkron's focus was exclusively upon the rate of industrial growth. Gerschenkron called this surge of industrial output characteristic of the Industrial Revolution a great spurt. And he believed that most successful industrial nations went through such a great spurt. Britain from the 1760s, France and Germany from the 1850s, Russia in the 1890s. What Gerschenkron wanted to explain was the defining characteristics of each country's great spurt. The second key term is that of economic backwardness. Now this phrase does sound rather ominous, and more so than it really is. It makes one think of a country sunk in poverty, stagnation, but that is not Gerschenkron's meaning. For Gerschenkron, all European economies, besides that of Great Britain, were backward in the early 19th century. His point is that as soon as Britain entered upon its Industrial Revolution in the 1760s, all other economies, from France to Russia, became at that moment relatively backward. Of course, Gerschenkron assumes that modern industrial growth represents progress, and that all countries will wish to advance through industrialization to modern economic growth and prosperity. Given this, insofar as Britain showed the world the way to a modern industrial economy, all other nations became technically, in this sense, backward. Hence it follows that for Gerschenkron, all subsequent industrializations have occurred in the context of relative economic backwardness. All countries embarking on the Industrial Revolution since, say, 1800 have done so in the shadow of one or more countries more industrially advanced than they are. It is the character of industrialization in the context of economic backwardness that Gerschenkron wished to understand. Backwardness, however, is not a once and for all concept. Although all countries from the moment Britain began to industrialise were backward, they were not all equally backward. There are degrees of backwardness. And Gerschenkron ranked European countries at mid-19th century in the following ascending order of degrees of backwardness. So first we have France, then Germany, third Austria, fourth Italy, and fifth Russia. France, in other words, was less backward than Germany, Germany less backward than Austria, and so on. Now how does Gerschenkron arrive at this ranking? To derive this ranking, he used the concept of prerequisites of industrialization. Prerequisites for industrialization are those conditions which exist in a society that have a propensity to induce an industrial revolution. Now, the only country where these prerequisites did initiate a spontaneous industrial revolution was Britain. So in effect, the prerequisites of industrialization were for Gerschenkron those features present in Britain in the 18th century which caused the subsequent industrial revolution. These prerequisite factors included a supply of capital wealth ready to be invested, a productive agriculture able to feed a growing population, an available labour supply ready to work in factories for wages, an entrepreneurial class prepared to innovate and invest for the future, reasonable levels of literacy and skill among the industrial labour force, and high standards of commercial honesty and the rule of law. It was such prerequisites that initiated the British Industrial Revolution, and Gerschenkron inferred that all other nations, which had yet failed to industrialise, must have been deficient in one or more of these prerequisites. Hence, the more a national economy is deficient in the prerequisites for industrialisation, the more backward it was. Formally we can therefore say that where the industrialisation of country A is a function of a range of prerequisites from A B, C through to N, whereas the non-industrialization of country B is due to a lack of any number of those prerequisites A, B, C through to N. France, for example, which possessed significant amounts of mercantile capital, an educated and fairly abundant labour force, a productive agriculture and the rule of law, was only moderately backward compared to Great Britain, whereas Russia was significantly backward, lacking reserves of investable capital, an entrepreneurial class, or a productive agriculture. And while Russia did have a large population, serfdom and peasant communal agriculture meant it did not possess a large supply of landless labourers willing to work for wages. Now, thus far, what we essentially have is a set of definitions. Industrialisation is a great spurt in the rate of industrial growth, and economic backwardness refers to the state of any economy that has yet to embark upon modern industrial growth. Degrees of backwardness being defined by the extent to which any given economy lacks the prerequisites for successful industrialisation. What converts Gerschenkron's model from a static to a dynamic one are two propositions. First, Gerschenkron argues that a growing tension will develop within a backward nation as the economic gap between itself and the successful industrialising nations grows wider and wider. There's a growing consciousness of the disparity within a backward nation between the actuality of that nation and its potentiality. The country becomes more and more aware of the inferiority of its position, which might be reflected, for example, in military weakness, and will realise how much more prosperous and powerful it could be if it made use of the best available technology. At some point, this tension provokes the country into its own industrial revolution as it catches up with the industrial leaders. Second, if a backward country is to industrialise, then it must by definition make good its lack of those prerequisites for industrialisation, whose absence made it backward in the first place. Since it lacks key developmental factors, such as a plentiful supply of labour or capital, it must substitute other factors to make good for this deficiency. So all countries which commence industrialisation in the context of backwardness can only do so by substituting alternative growth factors to overcome the initial lack of industrial prerequisites. And the more backward a country is when it commences the process of industrialisation, the more it must make such substitutions. In this way, Gerschenkron is able to explain the differing patterns of industrialisation in 19th century Europe. All industrialisations after that of Britain will involve substituting factors for missing prerequisites. And the more backward a country is, the greater the extent such substitutions will have to be. For example, a backward country lacking reserves of private capital will have to substitute alternative sources of capital funding, such as utilising investment banks or government investment. Hence, Gerschenkron contends that the observed pattern of industrialisation in Europe and beyond was determined by the initial degree of backwardness in the countries concerned. Now, guided by these two propositions, Gerschenkron is able to make a series of generalizations regarding the course of 19th century industrialisation in the context of relative economic backwardness. First, the more backward a country is when it commences its industrial spurt, the more rapid will that spurt be. Later industrialisers grow faster than early industrialisers. France grew faster than Britain, Germany faster than France, Russia faster than Germany. The reason is, says Gerschenkron, because the more backward a country is, the greater the creative tension between its actuality and its potentiality, the greater its scope for borrowing revolutionary technologies that will transform its economy. Where Britain's industrialisation used horses and canals to transport goods, later industrialisers can use railways and motor vehicles. So while Britain's rate of growth during the Industrial Revolution was around 2 or 3%, Russia's in the 1890s was around 8%. Second, the more backward a country when it begins industrialisation, the more its industry will be dominated by capital goods as opposed to consumer goods. While the cotton industry led Britain's industrialisation, later industrialisers like Germany and Russia focused on iron, steel and engineering. One reason is that backward economies will wish to deploy the most advanced technologies available. In the 19th century, the capital goods sector was more advanced than the consumer goods sector, many of whose products such as clothing, furniture, household objects were still largely made by hand. Thirdly, the more backward a country when it experiences its great industrial spurt, the higher will tend to be the capital-labour ratio in its factories. Backward countries tend to lack a supply of semi-skilled wage labour accustomed to workshop discipline. To make good this deficiency, these backward countries tend to substitute machines for workers. Fourthly, the more backward an economy, when it commences its industrial revolution, the greater will be the degree to which it adopts large-scale plant. Gerschenkron sees this as another example of developmental substitution. Later developers tend to lack a supply of entrepreneurs willing to innovate and invest for the long term. Hence, large-scale factories enable the economy to economise on the use of skilled managers and forward-thinking entrepreneurs. Fifth, the more backward an economy, the more it will have to improvise institutional instruments to make good the lack of existing investment capital. In Britain, sufficient capital funds existed to initiate industrialisation, growth then proceeding through the reinvestment of profits. Backward countries tend to lack such capital resources, so alternatives are required. In France and Germany, these alternatives came, for example, from the investment banks, creating credit to fund industrial growth. In Russia, such banking systems do not exist, so instead the state stepped in to provide funds for the building of infrastructure like the Trans-Siberian Railway and guaranteeing orders to industry. It can therefore be seen how Gerschenkron interprets the leading features of the 19th century industrialisation in terms of his model of economic backwardness, as later industrialisers substituted for initially absent prerequisites. There really are, for Gerschenkron, no absolute prerequisites for industrialisation. All can be substituted for, and it is the form of such substitutions take that accounts for the main features of each country's industrialisation. Of course, as a country develops industrially, its patterns of substitution will change as new growth factors become available. For example, as German firms grew in size in the later 19th century and had more resources, they had less need than they initially did for the investment banks. In the case of Russia, Gerschenkron believes that while the first great industrial spurt of the 1890s was heavily dependent on the state, the second surge of growth from 1906 to 1914 owed much more to the role of private banks. What then are we to make of Gerschenkron's theory of industrialisation? Now, what makes it attractive, I think, is the manner in which he encompasses the industrial histories of a range of countries. It helps us to view European industrialisation as a whole, rather than simply in terms of the confines of a series of nation states. And it does provide important insights. Gerschenkron helps us to appreciate, for example, the role of investment banks like the Credit Mobilier in the development of France and Germany, just as he helps us to recognise the need for state intervention in Russia in the 1890s, where so many conditions for growth were absent. Yet, it cannot be denied that there are serious methodological issues with Gerschenkron's approach. First of all, he assumes a uniform trajectory for economic modernisation through an industrial big spurt. There's no reason to assume that all countries need to develop this way, or that industrialisation has to be rapid in late developers. Many developed countries today did not experience a big spurt of the kind analysed by Gerschenkron. We might think of Denmark, or Austria, Finland, Portugal, and so on. His model is limited and rather lacks nuance. Second, Gerschenkron's model is inadequately specified. Crucial propositions are asserted rather than demonstrated. For example, it is said that the more backward an economy is, the greater the impulsion to industrialisation becomes, as the disparity between its actuality and its potentiality becomes ever wider. But what triggers the surge to close the gap? What initiates it, and why? Gerschenkron basically suggests that elite decision takers, kings, politicians, bankers and bureaucrats make the strategic move. Now this may be true, but it means that the key surge to industrial modernity is largely a voluntary act, initiated by small groups of people for essentially non-economic reasons. This is not then really an economic explanation, and is exogenous to the model. It means that if asked why a particular country industrialised at all Gerschenkron can really answer is because leading people wanted it to, which of course doesn't exactly take us very far. Similarly, the substitution process, to which Gerschenkron attaches so much importance, is hardly justified very rigorously. Who decides which developmental factors are present and which are not? Who decides which growth factor substitutions to make? Who decided in 19th century Russia, for example, that labour was scarce and machines had to be substituted for workers? And this, of course, in a country where labour was abundant and cheap and capital was scarce. The substitutions are never really explained, and one cannot help thinking that what Gerschenkron was really doing is providing post hoc rationalizations for observed phenomena. Lastly, I would argue that Gerschenkron never gave sufficient attention to the British Industrial Revolution. The British Industrial Revolution is crucial to Gerschenkron's model as it established the preconditions necessary for what we might call natural, spontaneous industrialisation. It was precisely because Britain had a series of prerequisites for industrialisation in place in the 18th century that all other nations are deemed backward in lacking one or more of these prerequisites, with these absences leading to them to substitute for preconditions present in the British case. The very concept of a substitute, therefore, is defined relative to the British case. But there is a problem here. Historians do not really know what were the preconditions for the Industrial Revolution in Britain. There have been huge controversies about this. Did Britain industrialise because labour was plentiful and cheap, or because in fact labour was scarce and expensive? Did Britain industrialise because of a plentiful supplies of resources like coal or iron, or because it ran out of a crucial resource such as wood? Was a prior accumulation of capital through, for example, the slave trade, a condition for Britain's industrialisation, or was it self-financing through reinvested profits, and so on? The point here is that unless Gerschenkron can establish the conditions for British industrialisation, he cannot interpret the lack of these conditions in other countries as a symptom of backwardness. To be honest, his whole backwardness substitution model breaks down unless he can specify the character of non-backward development in the British case. Gerschenkron should have realised this, but he never really wrote much about the British Industrial Revolution at all. So again, his model must be seen as inadequately specified. To conclude, Gerschenkron is a great guide to industrial history of Europe. He's a wise and thoughtful writer, and through reading his work you will gain useful insights into 19th century history, and 20th century history too. But his model was far from being as rigorous or as operational as he clearly himself considered it to be. Thank you.